Thank you, everyone. Can you all hear me without the mic, or is that okay? So it's a pleasure to be here and to run this solo roundtable where I can just debate with myself in front of you all. No, and thank you for bearing with me through my disheveled demeanor. And I apologize in advance if I collapse of exhaustion during this lecture. When I tell you what I do for a living in a minute, you'll perhaps have a bit of sympathy for why I'm about to collapse of exhaustion. So thank you for the lovely introduction. Thank you for this opportunity. So I'm actually an anthropologist by training, an anthropologist who wears many different hats. For close to a decade, I had the privilege of being a professor of transcultural psychiatry here at McGill, where I co-directed a really cool program with Professor Ian Gold, that some of you know, called the Culture, Mind, and Brain program, that brought together neuroscientists, philosophers, cognitive scientists, and people who are interested in, I guess, the intricacies of the human experience um, from different perspectives. I went through lots of reconversions in my life. As an anthropologist, I started as a cultural anthropologist years ago, working with street kids in Brazil. And then I had a bit of a existential and epistemic crisis in the early 2010s, where I no longer believed a lot of the things I was teaching in terms of social constructivism. And so I wanted to go back and learn, and I wanted to do a postdoc with Ian Gold, actually, that some of you know. And that sent me into many different rabbit holes of just really fascinating research. I've had the privilege to work with so many cool people here at McGill, where with some colleagues, I pursued one line of theoretical work on the evolution of cognition and culture, another line of work on sort of embodied consciousness and placebo effects, and then a growing, increasingly intriguing and worrying line of work on the effects of the internet on cognition, on mental health, and on social relations. And over the years, as I became more, on the one hand, intrigued, but also concerned with the impact of the internet on social relations in particular, but also on epistemic dimensions of social relations. So the kinds of knowledge that people are constructing about the world, the kinds of increasingly seemingly fragmented realities that people lived in. I had the immense privilege of being invited to work with another team and to yet again in my life reconvert as a clinician, as a therapist, as it were. So since 2020, I've been working with Professor Cécile Rousseau, who's a child psychiatrist here at McGill, and who started a very interesting clinical and research team called the Polarization Clinic. That works with people who are at risk of ideologically motivated extremism and radicalization leading to violence. So I spend most of my days working with neo-Nazis, religious extremists, masculinists, would-be school shooters, and our team provides psychotherapy, social rehabilitation, but also training and consultation with different health services, with national security as well. So this is where I am now. But yet, I think that fundamentally, a lot of my work is still about human connections and human detachment and love, and I've maintained a longstanding interest in the anthropology, sociology, philosophy, and neuroscience of love. So I wanted to talk with you all about love in the digital age. I realize because time is limited, and so is my cognitive bandwidth and capacity to not collapse of exhaustion. So there's so many angles that I could take to talk about this. And I probably won't talk that much today about the digital dimension, even though I'll talk about dating apps, because so much could be said about what it is like as a species to have transitioned in the blink of an eye into a radically different ecological niche, a digital niche that is weirdly disembodied and fragmented, and yet that is real at the level of our experiences. So a lot can be said about that niche. I won't get into a lot of detail, but by all means, do ask questions. I think if I could give you the kind of the conclusion of where I'm at in terms of my research on the impact of the internet is that it's a great accelerator and amplifier of everything that is good and terrible about humanity, and is that the total impact is probably a net negative, but we'll return to that. So I chose a deliberately provocative title talking about incels. Femsing is incels. I'll define that. I'll talk a bit about incels. I'm sure many of you have heard of them. I would say a high number of my patients are either externally identified as or identify themselves as incels. The term Femsing is not as known. I think it refers to involuntarily single as opposed to involuntarily celibate. But I usually, let's see. When I used to teach undergraduate classes or give lectures, I often like to begin with a kind of a puzzle, a mystery that I invite the audience to solve with me. Some of you may have heard of what journalists have termed a sex recession among millennials, Generation Z, and not sure about Gen Alpha yet, but this idea that young people are having less and less sex. They're having less and less intimate relationships, less and less romantic relationships. So that was an investigative article from 2018 in the Atlantic who asked, well, why are young people having so little sex? There's been lots more data coming on this, and this is from a very recent article in The Economist that looked at very interesting demographic variables in this. And it so happens that the more educated people are, the less sex they have. So it's interesting, we used to associate universities with free love and drugs and rock and roll, but it appears as though there's an inverse correlation between, someone's higher education and how much sex or how much, even romantic connections they're having. So according to this article, just being in college and then, this increases exponentially. So with an undergraduate degree, well, less sex, a graduate master's, even less so, a PhD, even less so. So what's going on, right? It's an interesting puzzle. This may or may not be tied to another interesting phenomenon in terms of evolution and development. We know that adolescence is usually a time for testing limits and boundaries and for sampling uncertainty and taking risks in the world. Well, there has been in high-income countries, so Western Europe, Scandinavia, Great Britain, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, the US, etc., a documented great decline in risk-taking among adolescents and young adults. So less sex, less teenage pregnancies, less drugs, less reckless driving, less driving altogether. Anyway, so I think there's a kind of an interesting puzzle because if we are together to examine the question of love and intimacy in the digital age, well, we're beginning with this perhaps evolutionarily novel, historically novel picture of a species that appears to be doing less of what it needs to do to reproduce. So I propose to examine it through the provocative example, first of incels. And I propose that we together reconstruct a little bit of an evolutionary story on love, intimacy, and sex. A story with a Freudian twist, not Freudian in the sense of talking about young boys fantasizing about their mothers, but simply something that I quite like about the psychoanalytic, psychodynamic, but also evolutionary approach, which is to look at a trait, a behavior that appears to be odd or pathological or psychopathological, and from there to reconstruct the adaptiveness of a normal mechanism. So for example, people who have obsessive compulsive disorder may experience, great distress, etc. But it turns out that there's a dopamine story about learning and about predictability. I mean, it's just something fundamentally normal, adaptive, and necessary that people do a little too much. So let's try to examine then, first, taking what may or may not be the historically novel phenomenon of incels. So here I apologize for my very inelegant slide. This is taken from a brochure that our clinic and research center puts out and offers to institutions. What do we do as teachers or as colleagues, when a young boy appears to be going down the incel rabbit hole. And we try to offer actually a clinical, rather neutral definition before getting into the ideologies and the risks. I mean, incel simply means involuntary celibate, and it refers, very, very broadly to a set of ideas, discourses, anxieties, tips, and what have you, around the reality of male sexual misery. and male sexual and romantic existential misery. So interestingly, some of you may not know, the term was first coined by a woman on a subreddit dedicated to single females, but it's since been taken up mostly by young men who exchange advice or rants on well, the travails of attempting to find sexual and romantic relationships. In the public imagination, I would say, certainly in terms of media coverage, there's been a strong association with the idea of male supremacy, misogyny, going as far as terrorism. So Canada is quite unprecedented in having convicted a young male offender who committed an ideologically motivated murder as a terrorist. So there's now jurisprudence in Canada. But a closer cyberethnographic, epidemiological, and clinical look will show that actually, as all identity labels, it's very complex. So incel can be a sort of a slur that is externally, assigned to someone. It could be a term that people identify with. But again, I would say the vast majority of young boys and men who frequent those forums or who read this kind of content do not necessarily identify as incels. And there's a very broad ideological spectrum that is represented. So contrary to some popular beliefs, for example, some of you may not know that a significant proportion of incels are not white, are come from different ethnic minorities. In terms of danger, it is true there's a gradient, there's a sort of a spectrum that can go, very tragically as far as identifying with different mass shooters and incitations to misogynistic violence. But by far the biggest risk for young men who get caught in this rabbit hole is self-harm and suicide. Yes, I'm not going to go into sort of, how to help. This is just to kind of, present incels. What's interesting, and I wanted to present the outline of an incel theory of mating. What's interesting is that there are also lots of epistemic tensions around incels, and in particular, the kinds of theories that they leverage and that they devise and that they exchange, to justify why it's difficult for so many of them to find a sexual or a romantic partner. So one of them, a central tenet, is the idea that women select and that males compete for female attention, and that women are very selective, and that it's very, very hard for most men who are not good-looking, tall, rich, of a particular social status to even get the attention of different women. So there's this sort of look-centric or so-called Chad theory. So Chad, many of you may know in incel speak, refers to a stereotypically tall, muscular, dominant man. So this idea of height, looks, and money. So for many young men who do not identify with that, or who are not identified as that, who are not so-called Chads, there's all kinds of ideologies justifying while the cards are stacked evolutionarily against you, there's just nothing that you can do. So here, I wanted us to, get back into the question of examining what is happening to intimacy in the digital age by first trying to, I guess, suspend disbelief and ask, could it be true? Could a lot of this, could an incel theory of human mating and human intimacy actually have some basis of truth? And if we bracket off, any ideological dimension to this. So here I have to begin again with a disclaimer. As an anthropologist, I'm always intrigued and charmed and amused and sometimes enraged, with the very strange beliefs that people hold in different cultural niches. And here I want to, I'm reminded that I'm speaking to an audience of highly educated, smart university students, which I think from a historical and anthropological perspective holds very, very peculiar beliefs about sex, about gender, and about mating, and about gender identity. And the point is not to judge or to ask whether those beliefs are real or not. Well, they are at the level at which your generation talks about polyamory and talks about gender identity and a level of fluidity that many of you now take for granted as true and good, but which from other perspectives might seem very, very strange. Um, and I want to reconstruct a little bit of an evolutionary story, not at all to challenge, whatever beliefs and values are held in this particular historical moment, but just to examine whether there's something to incel theory that might help us understand generally, anthropologically, evolutionarily, human intimacy and human mating. So something that may or may not, because I shouldn't take anything for granted, something that may not be readily evident to many people born and raised, after the 2010s or the 2005s, is that there is indeed universally for all humans, but also for all mammals, probably for all vertebrates, a universal biology of what eventually becomes something like love, um, and that it is evolutionarily intrinsically tied to, well, to parenting, to reproduction. And that as such, and we're going to get there may still be, regardless of whatever values we might aspire to, there may still be some sexually dimorphic constraints. There may still be some ways in which our biology and our psychology are still constrained or at least in some ways shaped by these reproductive constraints. So, and this may be completely banal to many of you, and if so, then great. But it is sometimes forgotten that this wonderful, scary, feeling of love is really tied to pair bonding, to the pair bonding instinct. So this is a long and fascinating story that I don't have the time to tell, but the human species about 2 million years ago uh, really really went through like an extraordinarily like a crazy bet, a kind of a trade-off where we gave up our individual intelligence and our physical strength, and we sort of chose, and this is not a conscious choice, but as a species, as a niche construction strategy, we became weaker physically, but much, much, much smarter. So we started investing a lot in our frontal cortex. And as such, we started investing in raising very, very vulnerable young babies who take a very, very, very long time to mature outside of the womb. So the anthropologist Ashley Montagu used to refer to humans as exterogestates. So the gestation period continues outside of the womb for a very, very long time. And as humans, well, it turns out that we have been almost so denatured that in order to meet every single one of our basic needs, but even in order to be able to walk, to sleep, to feed ourselves, to meet all of these basic needs, we need other people. And we need a cumulative repertoire of cultural solutions that is preserved and improved across generations. So alloparenting means other parents that are not just the mother. In order to survive as a species, we had to engage in collective child rearing. So it is from this that the human capacity to love, I think, took some very, very interesting evolutionary turns, which again, and this is where I want to get to, are maybe again getting hijacked in the digital spheres in really interesting ways. So this basic neurobiology of love is universal. Some of you who are in the more humanities side of your studies might have come across what, in my view, are almost conspiracy theories, to the extent that romantic love is an invention of the West and of Western troubadours, and that, well, I mean, I challenge each of you to think, well, what does that actually entail? Do you mean that there's no love in other cultures, that people don't feel, longing and pleasure and pain? So I used to, in my longer undergraduate lectures, read some poems or some folk songs from like Tutsi highlanders in Rwanda or medieval Japan or the Amazon, where young, men and women, talk about the pains of being ghosted and just the, this feeling of intense but at the same time pleasurable anxiety, which we can all recognize. The what was the Helen Fisher book? One of the evolutionary stories about romantic love, and which you're free to contest because I'm not sure how falsifiable it is that one of the reasons why humans struggle at long-term committal monogamy is that uh, passionate love is designed to last about 4 years, which is thought to be the time that it takes to raise a human offspring to be independent enough to not have to be, in the presence of its parents. I'm a little ambivalent about that theory. I'm not sure, but again, by intense, passionate, romantic love, we mean something that is very close to psychosis in that it induces a very, very strong psychologists call it a positive illusion, and I think most of us know what it's like to have these rose-colored glasses where we're only attentive to people's qualities and we're blind to their flaws, and it is really quite pathological when you think about it, right? It induces this constant feeling of anxiety, increased heart rate, weight loss, inability to focus on anything else. It's not sustainable, and you examine any wisdom tradition from any culture, there's a story that says at some point you need to move on to something like companionate love or companionship, or you need to build friendships. And there's all kinds of tips and recipes that work and don't work to some extent. When I talk about the evolved universal nature of this capacity for love, I'm really talking about the capacity to develop an attachment system. And here it's important to adopt an evo-devo approach. So to look at both the evolutionary timescale of the evolution of a species and the traits that are conserved and that are innate, and the traits that are ontogenetically developed, meaning over the life course of an individual's development. And for humans, that means, in their cultures and their different families, this is when these traits will be honed and fashioned into, in fact, different things, but not that many different things. So, very quickly, a quick rundown of the kind of attachment system. So romantic love would be the most intense, also sexually charged version of that. But the attachment system is also linked to our relationship with our peers, with our family, with our bosses, with our friends. And we all oscillate along a sort of a scale of secure to anxious and disorganized attachment. So ideally, and on this, the psychoanalysts have yet to be, I think, challenged in that, to the best of our current scientific knowledge, a lot of our attachment systems are shaped in very, very early developmental years, very early in our lives, depending on the relationship that we had with our primary caregivers. So ideally, we want everybody to be secure. That leads to a high self-esteem, but also high trust in others. And some people are more anxious, so they're very clingy. They can't really be alone. And these, you can guess where I'm going, translate into different romantic relationship styles. Some are more avoidant. They have difficulty creating attachments. They need a lot of personal space. And some, I mean, this is the bad news about people who usually have some form of complex trauma. Well, they don't trust themselves, they don't trust others, or they oscillate from different types of anxieties. But again, here a little bit of cultural evolutionary theory that I like. These types of anxious attachments don't predict the same kinds of outcomes depending on your culture. For example, in highly individualistic cultures like our own, it's actually adaptive to be avoidant. And the way I like to present it to my undergrads, I say, to think of an individualistic culture, well, ask yourself, do you come from a culture where your friends help you move and they drive you to the airport? Or do you come from a culture where your entire family drives you to the airport and cries every time that you leave? So in a family, in a culture like this, in a collectivistic culture, there's really, really high cost to being avoidant. You get shunned, you get kind of excluded. But again, in an individualistic culture, it's better because individualism also means that most of the time, nobody is going to pick us up from the airport and nobody is going to help us move. So it's a lot more adaptive. So later we can ask again, well, can we diagnose a sort of a dominant attachment style when it comes to love in the digital age? So now quickly moving through, I guess what evolutionary biology and evolutionary human biology is at in terms of evolved differences between males and females on average. So of course, there's always a gradient and there's always overlap. Um, is that, well, initially, the cost of a relationship, of a romantic relationship, are just not the same for males and females. And we're talking pre-contraception, pre-birth control. And, the long story short for all of these, and I'm not going to go through all of these points, is that for human females, and sorry for sounding like an ethologist, I often think of myself as a human ethologist, the potential cost of any kind of relationship with a man are enormous. The risk of sexual assault was always there. I'm going to return to that. But the risk of an unwanted pregnancy completely changes your life. It changes your body, it changes your neurobiology, it changes what you can and cannot do for the next 20, say 30 years of your life. So they're very, very strong, and this is what we mean when we talk about reproductive constraints. For a male, for a human male, actually, the constraint is the opposite, and we're going to return to it. It is, for many reasons, more difficult for males to be worthy of that kind of female attention. So a reproductive strategy is rather hypergamy, is to spread your seed as much as possible. But we've already established that for a viable human to flourish, it takes a secure social environment of alloparental care, developing all these beautiful, secure attachments and so forth. But all a man has to do, and this is quite sad, this is sad news for males, is just plant your seed in a relationship that might not even be consensual, and that's it. You've sort of passed on your genes. So from there, and we're going to get there, we lead, and this is, at least commonly agreed upon in evolutionary psychology and evolutionary biology, a justification for why it would make absolute sense evolutionarily for women to be more cautious, also for different social systems to be organized around the protection of women from unwanted male sexual attention. So from this, we get perhaps a little bit of a validation of what would now be a kind of an incel take on why it really makes sense for women to be more guarded. So a lot of research finds, and this was counterintuitive to me the first time I read it, that men are allegedly more romantic than women in the sense that men often say, I love you first in a relationship. Men have evolutionary incentives, we have seen it, to sort of pursue. They have to stand out somehow. And women have evolutionary incentives to be a little bit more guarded, to be cautious, I'm really going to check this guy out and maybe ask, my aunt and my grandmother and, to make sure like he could potentially be a good father, that he would be safe around the kids, or is he even going to stick around, right? So from this, we get a sort of a really complex and often tragic and at times, beautiful and also fun kind of evolutionary arms race where females and males, and even more so in the human species, have almost opposite evolutionary strategies. So from there, we get very, very different intrasexual competition strategies. Intrasexual competitions means how members of the same sex compete for the best partners to get the best offspring with the best genes, etc. And the thing about the Homo sapien species, and I explained it only very briefly, is that genes only matter somewhat. It's about a lot more than just basic health and basic reproductive fitness, and we're going to get there. Again, it takes a capacity for cooperation, it takes different types of personality traits, it takes a social network for a child to be raised in the best environment. But human males, much like males among other mammalian and vertebrate species, do all kinds of silly things and dangerous things to compete and to signal in very, very costly ways that they're strong, that they're smart, that they're verbose, that they're funny, in order to attract female attention. So these very overt, direct, often very violent competitions. And I like to think sometimes when I look at just men doing backflips or taking dangerous selfies or uh, a lot of just kind of crazy things that men do, not necessarily consciously. The evolutionary anthropologist in me thinks, yeah, I mean, these are costly signaling sexual reproductive strategies. For women, it's typically, and this is really quite universal, much more covert, much more competing through reputation, through gossip, uh, very, very different. So this is an old paper from Jeffrey Miller, who's a cognitive scientist, trends in cognitive science paper from the late 80s called Mate Choice Turns Cognitive, when there was a lot of debate in the new young field of evolutionary psychology that was just in the process of acquiring an unfortunate reputation that it still has now, that it's basically just Nazis and white supremacy, et cetera. And it's interesting to examine why does this field elicit such strong reactions. Probably, I don't know. My guess is because it touches something very, very profound in the human experience, and that we have a great reluctance to see it being explained in terms of animal behavior, and probably because of, again, the historically novel values that we have now, striving towards a kind of gender equality, which is, by most accounts, great. But remember from your philosophy classes the sort of the is-ought fallacy. Um, just because there are differences on some level does not mean that people should not have the same kinds of opportunities. But just because, and this is again for the philosophers among you, notice how very often in any kind of scientific inquiry, we begin with an ethical premise because we're motivated to see the world being just and being good in a particular way. And then we work our way down and we try to reconstruct our ontology in the way we see the world as already fitting the way we would want the world to be. Anyway, Jeffrey Miller is one of the ones who has probably the least worst reputation in evolutionary psychology, probably because he's been very active in queer politics. I think his latest book is about his own polyamorous relationship with his polyamorous, partner. But this was, the stock of knowledge at the time that hasn't really changed, which is, here is a usual, mostly on a subconscious level, how human female evaluates a potential mate in terms of its attractiveness. So there's been tons and tons of studies. Again, is beauty socially constructed? Yes, to a large extent, but it's interesting. You see historically and from culture to culture, we fluctuate in the extent to which secondary sexual characteristics will be concealed or will be more revealed. And sometimes we like to be more plump, sometimes we like to be, thinner. But symmetry, facial symmetry, absolutely universal. A person who lacks, facial symmetry will typically be rated as less attractive. And there's tons of studies on how humans allegedly are able to subliminally pick up on indicators of fitness and of health and even of immune system integrity. So there's a paradigm called the great histocompatibility complex, whereby, and this is the whole research on pheromones, some of it is kind of quack and does not replicate, some of it replicate. But apparently there are ways in which when two humans who are compatible in terms of their immune systems and producing viable offspring meet, well, the magic of attraction happens. Height, these different types of ratios, yes. But where incels are probably wrong is that that's only a small part of the picture. So wit, humor, vocabulary size, intelligence, super, super important. Again, remember that as humans, we have traded off our physical strength for collective intelligence, for a frontal cortex, but also kindness, adaptability, cooperation. So this is, and I go through great pains sometimes trying to explain to my incel patients, and explaining doesn't work. People need to be validated in their suffering first, but to say, no, actually, it does pay off to be a nice guy. It's not true that nice guys finish last. Uh, but incels, unfortunately, are obsessed with this idea that there's only 10% of super Chad males who monopolize the entire sexual market. And we're going to get there in a minute. But where incels may be partly correct is that cultural capital, education, job status, a lot of it is probably initially evolutionarily about social capital, about the size of someone's network. Oh, not net worth, network, social network. Are there people to help? Are there going to be uncles and aunts and cousins around and people who are, or is this just some loner who doesn't have much to offer? Um, so attraction would be all of these traits, but it is probably mostly unconsciously computed in the way we form, alliances and friendships, but also attractions. So monogamy is interesting because monogamy appears to be a somewhat evolutionarily and historically novel cultural package. So again, pair bonding, yes, absolutely. And it appears to be, even though humans are really quite unique among primates in having fathers that stick around some of the time, some guys, it's a little better. But you see vestiges, not vestiges, but the precursors of that. It happens once in a while. It's been known for like a male chimpanzee to like adopt to adopt a little chimp. It's quite rare. It's quite rare. Um, but human societies have not always been monogamous. And it seems that for most of human history, even though there were some variations, polygyny, which is really sort of a type of polygamy that appears to benefit males, where one guy has several wives, um, appeared to be the norm. Polygyny, and the point, of course, and as an anthropologist, my point is not to judge and to morally rank different societies, in terms of how they organize their lives. But if we take something of a public health approach, I think it's correct to note that polygynous societies tend to exhibit much, much higher rates of violence, of organized crime, and appear to be somewhat complicated, pretty much for everyone. There's a mathematical problem. If you take, roughly there's about 50% males, 50% females, like maybe, I don't know, 0.1 more uh, females. But if you have some guys, a small number of men who have 4 wives each, that means that the majority of guys have absolutely 0 wives. And on this front, and this is very interesting, there's been studies on the testosterone levels of men in polygynous societies, men who don't have access to even a potential mate, who are just shut off the market because they're too poor, they're not worthy enough to find a potential mate. Testosterone tends to go up. Guys together tend to get in trouble. Criminality tends to go up. Sexual violence tends to go up. There are many, in my view, credible theories of the origins of human warfare being linked to this particular problem. So this is just, one analysis of what we know from Aboriginal Australia, but there's similar analyses from Amazonia, from Papua New Guinea, and from other societies, where basically the number one reason for conflicts among villages was rights over women. So basically, low status guys who could not find a wife go and raid the other village, for women. It's very, yeah, it's a complicated cultural package. Polyandry, societies in which some women are said to have multiple husbands, are, I think, something of an anthropological hoax. So what I think was initially mistaken for polyandry has been observed in the high plateaus of Tibet, in some parts of Polynesia. But really what it is, these are polygynous societies where some women, low status men, can share a wife. So rather than like an all-powerful woman who gets to boss around 4 or 5 husbands, it's usually the opposite, actually. It's usually a woman who's being bossed around 3 different husbands. So monogamy, it's a long story that I won't tell, but it's become more and more prevalent, and it appears to be a cultural package that at least And it's strange because as I hear myself speak, it sounds like I'm preaching, but uh, that confers a bit more egalitarian way to channel parental investment and pair bonding instincts. So that you find typically less conflict, less crime, but it takes work. It's complicated. And humans, and perhaps in the discussion we can talk about that, humans are not very good at the end of the day. You know, one of the reasons why our divorce rates are so high could also be that we live longer. Uh, in the past, relationships tended to last, 10 to 15 years. Child mortality was also much higher. It could also just be that because it's difficult to sustain desire, love. Those of you in neuroscience might know that arousal decreases with exposure. If you get the same reward predictably every time, it's not as appealing as when there's the sort of high uncertainty, the emotional roller coaster of, say, an early courtship where you don't know if you're being ghosted. So now, some, by some accounts, cynical anthropologists and others have pointed out that in the digital sphere, on dating apps, we may be returning, in a sense, to something like pretty manic and pretty emotionally unsafe polygynous societies. Um, for having examined this phenomenon a lot, and for having worked with a lot of people, even as a clinician, and coaching them through the pains and the travails of being on dating apps, I would say it's probably overall a pretty harrowing experience for both men and women for different reasons. But for, again, I would say an accentuation, a hysterical augmentation of all of these reproductive constraints that can, be quite stressful. One of the problems for women, first of all, is that there are many, this is about a 60-40 ratio, say. There are always going to be more men on these apps. But some of you may or may not know this, but where incels are unfortunately quite factually correct is that depending on different dating apps, different studies, different stats, I would say between 75 and 95% of men never get a date. At least 70-80% never ever get a like. They just don't. Whereas your average woman, just opening the app will be just bombarded with just unwanted likes and pictures of parts of the body, that etc. So again, we see an accentuation of this sexually dimorphic kind of arms race. But it is the case that for most men, and this is a former engineer from Tinder who very rapidly became canceled after he published this Medium blog piece that kind of went viral, where he actually compared what it's like to be a man on Tinder as the inequalities of very low income countries. So the Gini coefficient measures inequalities and inequalities of opportunities as well. So the way he computed this, Tinder is something like between Venezuela and South Africa. So it's really difficult. And I've spent a lot of time sometimes just trying to coach young men in how to talk, how to present themselves, how to pick. But the amount of skills that it takes to be able to pick the right kind of to hit the right kind of aesthetic, to have the right kind of photo, the right angle, that's hard. Just getting a like is hard. 70 to 80%, boom, out, never. But even then, from a like to a match, from a match to a date, from a date to the person not leaving and asking for the check after 5 seconds, from a date to a second date, etc. Well, it turns out to be much more difficult than what the majority of young men are able to do. But what about women, and what about women who might also be involuntarily celibate? So this is a very interesting paper with an odd methodology, because it's based on this best-selling book that came out in Sweden last year. It has not yet been translated in English. I cannot wait, or I'll find a way to maybe just crack it, and because I've been desperate to read this book. It's called Half of Malmo Consists of Guys That Dumped Me. So this is a Swedish influencer and journalist, really smart, high-power woman who, in her early 30s, decided, well, I've had fun, I have a career now. I think I'd like to meet a husband. I think I'm ready to have kids. Uh, and so she downloaded Tinder and she embarked on a journey to find a good guy. 5 years later, she was suicidal. Uh, and she decided to write a book about having dated fully so cops, firefighters, professors, construction workers. She tried them all. She had and she seems great, but she said she had great difficulty making it to a fourth date with most of these guys. Uh, so this paper analyzes, data on dating apps, but also, the narrative of this young woman, and asks if dating online might just exploit and hijack the wrong part of human psychology, and if in the end it might not just altogether, frankly, suck for both men and women. So the idea here, and one of the conclusions, so the conclusion of this, the conclusion of this paper are interesting because some of them are relevant to my clinical work. There's an invitation for both men and women to try to have empathy for how difficult it is to be on the other side. And often, and this sometimes work with my incel patients when I try to, get them to open up to the idea that it's actually just not that easy to be a woman on a dating app. And yes, you may get a lot of unwanted attention, but then they'll reply, yeah, it's because it's 10% of Chads who are just fuck boys and who are treated them like discardable items. And if only they would date me, well, I would be the perfect father and I would be. But one of the conclusions, which is well, it's disturbing because it's again, frankly, quite ethological and probably not very much in line with the kinds of values that most of us like to entertain now. But it's also looking at how the hypergamy hypothesis is most assuredly verified by a lot of data from dating apps, meaning that people typically try to date above their pay grade. So that's again, if you take for granted that there is an overall kind of attractiveness package, even overall physical attractiveness, and that people who date within their register are typically more successful at having a lower anxiety or more fulfilling kind of relationship. So it could very well be that a lot of young women now have access to guys who seem like top guys, but who might actually be fuck boys, but who themselves are incentivized evolutionarily to just date, which does not lead to, and I didn't go at all into, what it's like to live in a postmodern digital society and how lonely and impulsive, etc. we are, but again, uh, so this is the sort of the proposal here is that, in examining human intimacy, attachments, love, sex from an evolutionary perspective, leading to the sort of digital age, we may be again hijacking ourselves into a kind of loneliness that is, well, altogether not very pleasant. I do want to finish with, for those of you, by the way, who identify with your sex at birth and who are interested in long-term partnered monogamy and having children or not. The idea that divorce rates have been increasing is not that simple, or it's not that correct. We again have to look for different demographic variables. So I began this lecture by pointing out that it appears as though university-educated people have less sex and so forth. This may be true, but they have more stable marriages. So people with a university degree get married more, and they have less divorces. And this is the work of Helen Fisher as well, and other censuses in the US, Canada, and elsewhere. People who wait until they complete their degrees, get a job, then get married, actually tend to stay married. So divorce was first a kind of a luxury product of the luxury class, who could treat each other in all kinds of discardable ways. And as it goes sociologically, it appears to have now trickled down to more underprivileged people who definitely struggle difficulty, finding and forming and maintaining long-lasting relationships. So there's hope on that front. So I've spoken a lot, and I propose to end here and opening up for challenges, questions, concerns. Yes. So, what your ideas on the internet is like, as I see it, I'm not passing to the table. I feel like the internet has provided us with a lot of clarity. The real cases of the polarity and it feels like men dependence, it's trickling down to other social like divides. We are much more opposed than one another. Speak in a sense, like even even if we recognize and we respect each other, we do feel like a bigger divide. And I do think that's why the Incel culture, for example, goes in very polarized the individuals' intention. Yeah. Yeah, no, thank you. It's a great question. Has the internet introduced more polarity on multiple levels, including separation between men and women? So I hold what I hope to be a non-conspiratorial view of the internet. So while it is certainly the case that there are financial and political vested interests in some places in exploiting those divides, I think the internet largely gives us what we want. And if so, there is a cognitive bottleneck theory of the internet, which is that when faced with an overabundance of information, because again, pause for a second, the internet also holds the promise of having at the tip of our fingers, in our pockets, the entire memory of the human species, the possibility for everyone to express themselves, to share knowledge. And surely these things have happened to an extent. But when faced with an overabundance of information, we go for what is evolutionarily cheap. Just like we're attracted to Big Macs because we need salt, sugar, and fat. And those used to be rare substances that we need for our survival. What are the salt, sugars, and fats of the internet? Pornography, flexing, so selling stuff, which again, if you speak to my eminently canceled colleague Gad Saad at Concordia, studies, how flexing is a form of sexual selection. Moral outrage, a fundamental human need to identify our allies and what is true and what is good, and tribalism, absolutely tribalism. So when faced with a lot of uncertainty, everything we took for granted, about the world seems to be crumbling. We need to find our tribe. And this is the old like Dunbar's number kind of debate, in evolutionary anthropology. The idea is that because cooperation had some very tight bounds, we could only cooperate with a small group of people, including to raise children. So the average human can only handle, up to 200 people, like real relations. The rest becomes abstract. But yeah, we have certainly appeared to have become more tribal. Now, when it comes to I'm not certain that the internet increased sexual dimorphism. I think sexual dimorphism is not there, but it has also decreased it. So a lot of things have happened to gender and identity and sexuality. The internet has been a considerable accelerator of cultural change and cultural evolution. But from this, we have this idea of spandrels, right? There are traits that once evolved to serve a particular function, and now they're still there, but they kind of glitch. So this is the evolutionary mismatch hypothesis. So it could be, certainly in terms of our values of being altogether desexed and degendered and so forth, well, you could think of our reproductive organs as being spandrels. But anyway, I mean, it's a long answer to like a very good question. There was another hand before. Yes, was it you? A lot of people make this claim, but unfortunately, because any research on sex, gender, love touches something so intimate, it's almost impossible not to be ideological about it. So most of this research has some kind of strong confirmation bias built into it. It's very rare that someone says, I was a polygynous guy, whatever, and the data showed me this, therefore. So yes, some people make this claim. However, happiness is a very, very complex construct. It's not just one thing. Do you mean like eudaimonic happiness? Do you mean like euphoric, like whatever? I think there's research showing better outcomes, better developmental and socioeconomic outcomes for children raised in stable monogamous families. Yes. Um, but happiness, I'm not sure. Um, just like there are people, there are claims out there that arranged marriages, because they reduce uncertainty, yield relatively happier relationships because you remove all this deeply anxiogenic element of consumeristic choice. So imagine living in a society where you know exactly, at what age you will meet what kind of partner from what kind of, and the matchmaker, well, it'll be done after 3 minutes. But overall, I think what the human record shows is that we struggle, is that we need something like monogamy, or we need something like long-term investment in each other and our kids, and that we're good but not very good at doing it, and that we fail in many many ways. Yeah, yeah.
Do you think it makes sense to think of attachment styles as static, the way that table somewhat suggests that they are? So, for instance, in my experience, I tend to find that the state of my attachment to a romantic partner is contingent on, not determined by, my perception of how securely attached they are. And I think it's easier for me to form a perception of my partner as being securely attached to me if I'm more self-assured. But nevertheless, it's the case that if I perceive them as being insufficiently attached to me, or not like reliably attached to me over time, that I'll develop an attachment to them that is much more anxious. It doesn't seem like a feature, like an inherent feature of me or my psychology, so much as a byproduct of my psychology with my perception of how they are.
Yeah, very good. And I would say the best paradigms on attachment are cybernetic, ecosystemic, dynamic, and they show that it's not just one thing. However, I would say an attachment style, very much like a personality, is a relatively stable, basically pattern of statistical regularities in behaviors and patterns of attractions and rejections and responding that arises relatively early in development, that remains relatively rigid. But uh, it's the research in psychodynamics or in family systems theory that I think is more granular at showing how often, for example, we'll have a different attachment style with our mother and with our dad, and a different attachment style with our partners, and a different attachment style again. See, I'm avoidant with my parents. I'm overprotective of my children. I'm insecure with my wife. And I'm insecure with my boss, but I'm avoidant with, that has remained relatively stable kind of throughout my life. But it's also possible that, different kinds of partners might elicit in you. But at the same time, there is some kind of tending towards. And usually you can tell, and about yourself and about others, tends to be somewhat avoidant, whereas tends to be somewhat insecure.
We also have one online.
Oh, good. But you with the glasses, yeah.
Like how to make those solutions, like for example, how to and how people would have better.
Yeah, I would say following a Tradwife account, but of course the irony is that they're online. So it's like, why do you need to? No, this is a bad joke. I'm not sure we need a proposal, and I think in many ways it's there. I haven't looked at the latest stats, but I think less people, and if we look at by age range, I have a lot of hope in for Generation Alpha, actually, and I think younger millennials and Gen Z, and I love you guys. I mean, you're a fantastic generation, but you went through the pandemic. You were just on the tail end of this unprecedented experiment and you've been raised online, so a lot has been said. A lot of really judgmental things have been said about Gen Z and snowflakery and mental health. The point is not to judge, but there is emerging evidence, and certainly from our angle, like clinical evidence that younger people are, yes, they're still going to be connected, but they're probably going to use those devices differently, and they're going to privilege more and more kind of face-to-face activities. But the way to do it is simply to not use, that's the proposal. Just don't do it. Don't waste your time, because it's a significant time and anxiety investment. So did you have a question also? And then the online question.
Sure. Could a lot of this not be explained by socialization? It feels a little bioessentialist.
What be could you ask the person to explain
Your entire talk.
no
We can take the other question.
no but I mean, I think I again understand, and in fact I personally don't even challenge the kinds of egalitarian values that we have now, and it could very well be that through some freak accident of socialization, a kind of cultural scheme has spread throughout the human species, throughout the ages, to make us suspiciously behave like the mammals that we are very closely related to, or it could be that the ways in which we continue to exhibit animal behavior simply indicates that we have not been able to be magically divorced from the bio. But I find this intriguing sometimes. The way in which talks about biology elicits such strong anxieties that, well, I mean, I think I've just said it. This idea that even though we still behave like mammals, it's still socially constructed. I failed to grasp it even at this point. There was, I think, another. Yes, you.
This is super related to your talk, but I would like to hear more about the consulting national security work. Or like how there are many shows. It's like this.
Yeah, it's a longer conversation that I'm also happy to have offline. But all humans have a fundamental need to be validated and to be regarded positively. And people who become attracted to these kinds of ideologies almost invariably have gone through severe trauma. They've experienced social rejection. They continue to experience social rejection because of and from their perspective, complete gaslighting. So I think a lot of what we do is offer them validation that they're not getting in other places, because at this point in Canada, if you go and talk to a therapist and you say something racist or sexist, the therapist is likely to just end the relationship. And validating someone does not mean validating their explanatory model for why they suffer. People come and say, everything is because of what my aunt did to me when I was 3. Well, maybe not, but you suffer right now. And that actually, just that, does a lot. So we do that. We work on treating the underlying mental distress, not the ideology, helping rebuild social connections, social insertions, and then usually the ideology tends to decrease. I'm going in order. Yeah.
So about the bioessentialist point in your response, it was implicit, but is the point that this is transculturally stable, so biology seems to be more explicable than sort of social construction?
When the dream of cognitive science was conjured years ago, anthropology was belatedly invited to the table, because anthropologists are so, it was fantasized, were the bearers of the cross-cultural record. It's like, hi, I'm a psychologist, and I tested a bunch of white girls in my lab, and this is, humans. But then, they thought to invite anthropology and say, well, can we actually check? I mean, is this something that is actually found in other societies? hey, let's talk to historians, archaeologists. Is there and anthropologists have not been very friendly interlocutors in cognitive science. I mean, the divide, has, continues to spread. But yes, I think that's the premise. As you know, these theories are mostly unfalsifiable. But again, do we really need to like properly test? Are we actually mammals? Like, are we? There's also there's also a point where when I when I wonder. I know you had your hand up and yeah.
Question. How convinced Incel that being a good guy is a good thing? And second of all, could you touch a little bit more on that statement that you made? About how passionate love is not ending.
Yeah, maybe I'll focus on that one. Yeah, so I have to look more closely at Helen Fisher is an anthropologist and neuroanthropologist who's done a lot of work on the neurobiology of love, and she's put a lot of people in MRI scanners, and she has tons of surveys, and she draws on the works of other psychologists who've done tons of kinds of cross-cultural surveys. So I think this is a sort of an aggregation of what we know from the ethnographic record, but there are some extrapolations as well that are probably biased towards modern times, but it does seem, and I'm sorry I can't give you precise figures, but that it's rarely documented in the human record that people will remain completely passionately in love in the pathological sense of barely being able to function, right? I mean, if any of you have been in that state more than 4 years, it usually lasts much less long than 4 years. It usually lasts about 6 months. There's usually a first dip in about 6 months. So in a couple that is committed and that is in love, usually one of the two will become a little bit more avoidant, or is going to want like a little bit more personal time, but there's going to be a little bit more of a crisis, or like their libido will lower a little bit. And that's the first challenge. And passing that first 6 months bump, this predicts better outcome for the relationship. There's usually another one after 1 year. And then there's life events like, having a child and so on and so forth. But 4 years, the only reason that I have a soft objection to the 4 year, raising children is that I think this is too present centric, in that I don't think, and in fact, we know now that in the Paleolithic and among Homo erectus, there were no nuclear families living in there. This is a very historically novel thing with mommy. So this idea of like, daddy is a hunter and mommy's at home, tending the hides, and he comes home with the meat and says, what did you do today? No, this is not what happened. But I think it's a function of just the adaptiveness. You need this initial intensity to create the bond, but it would be completely pathological, because your attention is also needed elsewhere, included your children. The research on whether nice guys finish last or not is actually inconclusive, because incels are not entirely incorrect that by virtue, you see, my social constructivist friends are very correct in pointing out that we have become very, very different, even on an innate level, from our primate ancestors. We carry a lot of the vestiges of ape psychology and of mammalian psychology. And there's individual variations. So there's still something attractive to human females, to like a really strong chimpanzee that like bangs his chest. The Chads do get laid. This is true. But this kind of chimpanzee behavior does not typically yield very good child rearing, parenting, cooperativity. A lot of these guys often don't make very good partners. They can also be violent. And so incels, a lot of them, because there's a lot of heterogeneity, often dwell on this idea that, yeah, but women's psychology is just hijacked, and they're just going to go for this guy, and they're going to bypass, a nice, skinny twink like me. So there's research, but it's hard to research that across culture. There's Viren Swamy is a Malaysian British psychologist who has studied that, and he does cross-cultural studies on that, and he claims to find that this is an average picture again, but a lot of young sapiens females will initially try dating a few chimpanzees because it's kind of fun, but they eventually get tired of the chimpanzees. And this is true in the 21st century. By like their early 30s or late 20s, depending on where they are professionally and the different expectations placed on them by their culture, they're actually ready to settle for a nice guy. They might still have affairs with a chimpanzee, you know, from time to time. That is the politically uncensored version of the current state of the science on this. Yes. Mm.
So. In secret, polyamory, what is that social secure from an evolutionary perspective? Is it truly adaptive and it's exacerbating sex?
My take is that polyamory is a very adaptive strategy for the kind of cultural niche that we live in, because Zizek's take is also a moral take. I'm not a moral philosopher, right? I mean, I'm sympathetic to what he's saying. To me, polyamory is a testament to the deep human instinct for attachment and for bonding, and it's one way to do it in a society that affords very little commitment, and it's not, again, it's because too quickly people will say, oh, the snowflake millennials, they can't commit to anyone, so they'd rather just, you know, spread their seeds, etc. But again, it's often difficult, even like temporally, to find someone who are kind of available enough for you. There's huge constraints for young sapiens now. It takes 30 years to reach 35 years to reach what we call nutritional maturity, is when you're like a skilled enough hunter that you can like feed, you know, your group. So it's a way that this particular niche finds, you know, to still do the human things. Is it now, and this is not a moral point, but is it a viable strategy to raise children in? That may be complicated. I think we've yet to see a generation that is fully raised in polyamorous arrangements. But there have been some precedents. You know, the Israeli kibbutzim, not on polyamory, but in bringing back a kind of collective child rearing and decreasing the intensity of nuclear household parental roles. So I mean, who's to say, right?
The digital age does create this environment for polyamory more than, would you not say? I mean, with like, you know, endless or the illusion of choices, with this exchangeability, this objectification of people, we're viewing them through a lens that's the most natural in terms of like disposability, dating apps. Like, I wonder if polyamory, like polygamy, would thrive in this.
If polygamy would thrive more.
And through like the dating that's.
So again, polyamory, I mean, you need to put like even spatial bounds on these kinds of configurations, because polygyny, there's still a household, you know, with the, you know, like the co-wives and the guys. You know, polyamory is very fragmented. It's like, you know, I have, you know, 2 partners on Tuesdays and 3 on Thursdays, but they each have their own. If you drew the network, it would be pretty complicated. I think it's a network that kind of emulates the social organization of our times. The digital age is not a thing with intentions that wants things that creates. I mean, it's just the way in which human communication is organized now. And then we survive best we can, you know, with the tools that we have, and we devise these strategies. So I don't think classical polygamy would work any better than classical monogamy. In fact, it would be more complicated, you know, to keep more people in the same space and joint attention at the same time. But you could have a lot of kind of unofficial yes, polygamy. So you have people who are pretending to have a monogamous relationship, but who are still sampling what they can on the side. Yes, that increases, of course. Well, like I'm from France originally. I call it the French style, right? I mean, we like everybody cheats. Not really that big a deal. We pretend that we don't know about it, but we don't talk about like don't ask, don't tell sort of thing, like cheating. Yeah. Yeah, I think the gentleman has had his hand out for a while.
Like being in love for love stuff. Like, that my question goes into that. So I come from Greece again, not from here. And I find that it's like a big drastic they give us nowadays that they're going for love and for being the same thing. Because they're not the same thing. Being in love and loving someone is not really the same thing. I know my best friend, I love a partner,
Yeah, sure.
but I can only be in love with like, like 3 months.
Yeah.
So like, but we see that in a lot of societies that the essence of love, which is that kind of like, again, I'm willing to go out of bounds and do extraordinary things for someone. I'm not like passionately out of my in like a trance, sure. But I'm willing to like keep myself in order to that. Even though I've been with that problem. So do you think that like, we are kind of like in a way, and I think to our society which is becoming more individualistic by the years, and especially here in North America, the society is so individualistic versus Europe. Do you think that we're kind of like confusing these two boundaries and that's why like dating us is
Yeah, I think it could be. Yeah, that's a great question. And I think different languages, some languages I think are more precise and granular in the different love terms that they have. Like French is actually quite poor. There's no difference between love and like. I love my wife like I love chicken. It's the same. There's no but in English, for example, I think most people differentiate loving and being in love, and often say when your partner tells you, yeah, I love you, but I'm not in love with you anymore. Like it's spelled, actually the relationship is probably over at this point. Like that's no, but that depends. I'm being a little extreme, but it could be that by virtue of the very manic, individualistic, fast-paced, network configurations, we lack the proper time and care and opportunities to develop and to ignite this absolutely pathological like being in love, and that we favor more avoidant, more kind of diffuse strategies like polyamory. But again, I don't know. I need to look more into this community. I mean, do some people claim that they're able to sustain this feeling of passionate love that is differentiated for each, like say there's 6 or 7 or 8 or 12 partners? I don't know. I suspect that there are energetic bounds, mathematical constraints on, love is to an extent finite. That's but anyway, it was a great question. Thank you. Financial stress can be one, but it really depends on your socioeconomic status and where you are. There are some social classes that don't have those. I can tell you the research on successful couples that make it through. So this is the work of John Gottman, who had a really, really strange lab where for something like 30 years, they filmed couples, living together. They took urine samples, they took blood samples. They measured like heart rate, And communication style is probably the biggest, both risk and protective factor. So how a couple handles external stressors is not as relevant as how well they're able to manage their conflict. So a very, very common misconception, people go to couples therapy thinking, oh, we have these conflicts, we need to resolve them. The news is you will not resolve the conflicts because long-lasting conflicts typically stem from irresolvable personality differences. Rather, successful couples exhibit more positive affect during conflict. And there's even ratios that have been studied. And so John Gottman and his institute, they claim that they can film a couple arguing for 10 minutes and they can predict with like 90+% accuracy whether or not they will divorce within 7 years. I think that goes a little far. But the capacity to express humor, self-deprecation, positive affect during conflict, that's a great, great predictor. And then a few common pitfalls, common mistakes, exhibiting defensiveness, exhibiting, what is it? Defensiveness, criticism, stonewalling. There's a few things that people do, right? But I would say most of this research has still been done on relatively recent, mostly Western couples. And on that front, I again wonder. People in many societies have remained married because there were just no other options. People have also remained trapped in relationships that we would now call abusive because it was not even imaginable, right? So, yes, Rohan.
We've got 2 questions online.
Great.
One is, what is the highest leverage technique in your practice to de-radicalize incels? And then I'll say the next one after.
The best thing to de-radicalize an incel is to help him find a girlfriend. To help them find a girlfriend, to help them find a job, to help them reconnect with friends, to help them go offline. I think that the biggest, and it's not just incels, spend more time offline, meeting real people. A lot of incels actually, I would say, are not that radical at all. I mean, they just experience a lot of self-hatred and they subscribe to very defeatist beliefs about their incapacity to be loved. But yeah, establishing social connections and romantic connections.
I mean, that's a good segue for this next one. Do incels try to date outside of the league? Seems like they have a lot of smoke for female psychology being hijacked, but not theirs. More simply, femcels exist. Why don't they just date each other?
Why don't they just date each other as men?
Femcels and incels.
All the incels that I know who have dreamt of meeting the perfect femcels and have gone on femcels forums, the problem with femcel forums, and there's not that many of them, is that they get colonized and bombarded by incels who are trying to talk to women. So then the arms race works that way, and then the femcels, whoever they are, will try to retreat somewhere safer. So they're not actually bombarded because, again, most of the time, this is again on average. I'm not saying that there's never been an actual femcel, but the problem is rather finding a good person, finding a good person who's going to treat you well, who's not going to be abusive. But it's not finding anyone. Whereas a lot of incels can be so desperate that they would settle for anyone. Yeah.
Core anchor that meant to be together. So I mean, from a personal place, like I don't imagine dating apps to be a it's like this it's inevitable and
Yeah.
that will emerge through it's also due from the start. Like I'm just curious what your
Yeah, and that's a very good point. Thank you, because origin story is an important part of shared meaning. So successful, long-lasting couples are able to create shared meaning, shared mythologies. It helps a lot if they have some shared values in common. it's perfectly normal. It's often the case, for example, that the guy will be a bit more conservative, the woman will be a bit more liberal, and those make for great complementarities at times. There's an interesting dialectic. Um, but having a shared mythology, shared meaning, including the origin story, I think at this point it's become very common and perfectly acceptable, and people can still tell funny jokes about their first date and their first impression on Tinder. And the other anthropological kind of universal is that successful couples develop a whole battery of rituals, of rituals for being together, of rituals for that's Helen Fisher's work claims that a really important dimension of successful couples is that they continue to have sex. She says, and she prescribes continually. Couples therapists also they prescribe continue to have sex. You need oxytocin. You need to awaken this neurobiological cocktail that will reawaken, if not fully the pathological passion, this feeling of tenderness. So rituals that allow for the attraction to be rekindled, for tenderness to be expressed. That's also very important.
And still think there is, well, we treat meaning.
No, because remember, love is a positive illusion, and we've explained, or we've at least hypothesized its evolutionary function. In actual fact, every origin story of every love story is banal. It's frankly quite banal and boring. But what's actually lovely is the way in which couples will just their eyes will light up when they'll describe these extraordinary circumstances in which they're met. Usually there's nothing extraordinary. People meet through friends, people meet in a class, people meet on Tinder, whatever, but they're still going to have these salient memories of these little details that become meaningful to them, and that they can continue to mythologize and narrate and share it with others. So I'm not at all worried about I have met several couples that are still together after over a decade now, that met online, and they're doing great. I can take maybe two more questions, and then I will have to run to engage in paternal investment with my offspring. Yes?
This question isn't really about just but sort of how necessarily are the elements of sex.
So I would say most researchers, and a lot of research on love comes from the field of couple and family therapy as well. A lot of research will at least claim that sex is an important part of the package, even of the neurobiological package, to develop this kind of intimacy, the addiction to the other person, for the feelings, for the pleasant feelings to kind of last over time. Certainly it is possible, and there are many, I'm sure, successful sexless relationships or other arrangements when one partner becomes impaired and the other goes elsewhere. Is there an ideological bias in this research? I don't know. It does appear, however, as though and my patient clientele, I have a very biased sample. I don't just work with incels, by the way. I work with plenty of young people who are attracted to other kinds of ideologies. But going back to the sex resection point, it seems that collective libido has been decreasing somehow, that people are not as just excitable anymore. People are less interested in sex. And that again appears to be, on the one hand, evolutionarily odd, but also quite adapted to the kind of niche and human biology does adapt even to human values, and that's a longer story about these kinds of feedback loops. Yes.
When you talk about shared meaning, and just now when you're mentioning maybe having that people like mindset, which they're suppressing the investment they're making.
it's very likely a multifactorial kind of phenomenon, and it's very difficult, and I don't think we have the means to even weigh the different factors. So loneliness, I think stress and anxiety, also stress and anxiety decrease libido. And again, it's not at all a moral judgment, when we talk about high levels of mental distress among Generation Z. There's many things that are objectively stressful in this environment. So stress is a factor. Others talk about endocrine disruptors. There's clearly a conspiracy theory version of the fluoride in the water, but some claim that decreasing levels of fertility and testosterone may be linked to different things. From some people have claimed even SSRIs in the waters. So SSRIs, antidepressant medications, are known, not for everyone, but for many people, to significantly decrease libido. It's multifactorial. It's really complicated. The kinds of people that I work with individually, but I have my own psychodynamic kind of reading lens that, and I'm quite biased. I keep it in the people that I know who report having no libido or no desire to connect with others. I can typically trace some kind of a trauma story, so some kind of, rejection, fear of rejection as well. It's complicated, but what's interesting about this generation is that while on average there appears to be a decrease in libido and sexual relationships, fringe sexual behavior still exists, and it appears to be quite extreme also, and this is likely part of the same phenomenon. I'll take this final question. Yes.
Yeah. So like, what is it possible for an incel to get what they actually want? Because it doesn't seem as if they want sex, just sex. They want love. It seems that.
Absolutely. It's about a lot more than sex. It's about a lot more. It's about human connection. It's about having the most fundamental human need of being loved, of being touched, of being admired, of having someone who asks you how your day was. It's about getting out of just terrible, loneliness. Absolutely.
So I was wondering if, like, their belief system even enables them to meet certain like normative criteria for like loving another person. Because it seems as if, at least from my interactions and reading up incels, they have a very like causal view of women as just like objects who just kind of, as an automaton, just like it reacts to they react to certain stimuli in certain ways. It seems as if like someone who holds this belief about women can't actually see them as an equal, and therefore cannot meet the normative criteria for actually being in love with another person, being in a relationship.
I would say there is such a continuum, such a gradient of different types of beliefs. What all incels have in common is the existential misery of being alone and wanting to connect. And I think, the stories that are more salient and that we see and that become memes are sort of an extreme end of that. In the same way, another part of the manosphere, like say the sort of, trad guys, alpha males kind of movement, there's a bit of intersection. You could say there is a more kind of essentialized or idealized version. I would say if I could average out like an incel view on women, it's not so much, manipulative, etc. It's more this very naive view of this nurturing, mothering, kind, empathetic, right? A lot of the time it's an almost religious idealization of, what the feminine, the sacred feminine might entail. But I think you're right. A lot of them, it's not so much that their beliefs make them, incompatible with meeting someone, is that a lot of the time there's this kind of self-fulfilling prophecy. Because most of the time it's about personal distress. It's about having very, very low self-esteem. It's about having experienced, continued rejection and having the inability to think of oneself as lovable, which is sad. So folks, I do need to end, but I appreciate the conversation. Thank you for bearing with me. It's been a pleasure to engage with all of you. And yeah, let's somehow, I'm not sure how, stay in touch.